when one P-40 faced a Japanese air armada over Assam. He thought he was looking at 4 airplanes. At 12,000 feet above Assam, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair could see 4 dark shapes moving through the morning haze. They were still too far away to identify, and for a few seconds, he wondered whether they might be friendly aircraft returning to one of the Allied fields below. Then he completed another circle over Nagaguli and looked again. The 4 shapes were not 4 airplanes. They were 4 formations. As Adair closed the distance, the haze separated into wings, engines, and ordered rows of bombers. He counted 6 aircraft in each formation, 24 bombers by his estimate. Around them, scattered above, below, and along the sides, were roughly 40 Japanese fighters. The exact number remains uncertain. Later official accounts recorded a smaller force. But even the lowest estimate left no doubt about what Adair was seeing. A major Japanese raid moving toward the American airfields of northeast India. At that moment, he was the only American fighter pilot close enough to interfere. Minutes earlier, he had returned from a 3-hour patrol. His P-40 Warhawk, Lulu Bell, had barely been refueled when the red alert sounded. Adair ran about 100 feet to the aircraft. His crew chief already had the engine running. Adair climbed into the cockpit without stopping to put on his parachute or fasten his safety belt, opened the throttle, and was airborne in less than a minute. Only after leaving the ground did he secure himself in the seat. Now the Japanese formation was approaching the airfields that supported the hump. The dangerous air route across mountains into China. Adair knew he could not destroy an entire raid. He did not need to. If he could force the bombers to break formation, release too soon, or miss their aiming point, he might save the aircraft and supplies below. He radioed control, reported what he had found, and told them he was going in. Then, one P-40 turned toward an enemy force that may have numbered 64 aircraft. Before the morning ended, Adair would attack the bombers, fight his way through their escorts, follow one Japanese fighter into the Naga Hills, exhaust every round in his guns, and take hits that crippled his flight controls. His return journey would be nearly as dangerous as the battle itself. To keep Lulu Bell from diving into the jungle, he would have to fly part of the way home upside down. This is not the story of one pilot shooting down an entire air force. It is the true story of one man trying to make an entire air force miss. To understand why those airfields mattered, it is necessary to look beyond the war's famous fronts. The China-Burma-India theater was vast, difficult, and often neglected in public memory. Its soldiers and airmen sometimes called it the Forgotten War. Yet the fighting there was connected to one of the most important logistical problems faced by the Allies. China had been at war with Japan since 1937. After Japanese forces conquered Burma in 1942, the main overland route from India into China was cut. Until a new land route could be opened, most American supplies sent to Allied-controlled China had to travel by air from India. Transport crews flew eastward from Assam, crossing high mountains, violent weather, and some of the most unforgiving terrain in the world. The route became known as the Hump. It was dangerous even when no enemy aircraft appeared. The transports were often heavily loaded. Weather could change without warning. Ice formed on wings and propellers. Downdrafts could force an aircraft thousands of feet downward, toward mountains hidden by cloud. Navigation equipment was limited, and many crews crossed terrain for which reliable maps were scarce. Mechanical failure over the mountains often left nowhere to land and little chance of rescue. By the end of the war, hundreds of aircraft associated with the hump operation would be lost. Wreckage scattered across mountain ridges and deep valleys gave rise to the grim expression, the aluminum trail. The airlift nevertheless continued because China's armies and American air units operating there depended upon the fuel, ammunition, medicine, spare parts, and other supplies that crossed those mountains. Assam formed the western base of that operation. Airfields such as Chabua, Dinjan, Mohanbari, Sukarating and Nagaguli supported transport flights, maintenance, storage, and defense. On the ground stood unarmed transports, fuel dumps, workshops, warehouses, and men whose labor kept the supply route moving. A successful Japanese raid could destroy aircraft faster than they could be replaced, damage runways, ignite fuel, and interrupt operations at the most vulnerable point in the system. The Japanese Army Air Force understood the value of those targets. Bases in Burma placed its bombers and fighters within range of northeast India. Raids against Assam could threaten not only individual airfields, but the larger Allied effort to sustain China and regain northern Burma. The defense of that region belonged in part to the United States 10th Air Force and the 80th Fighter Group. The group's 3 squadrons, the 88th, 89th, and 90th, flew P-40 Warhawks. The men gave themselves a name suited to their aircraft and their surroundings. The Burma Banshees. Their P-40s carried a large white death's head across the nose. Some aircraft also used a siren beneath the fuselage, producing the wail that helped give the group its name. In a theater far from the headlines, the skull and the sound became the identity of the Burma Banshees. The P-40 was no longer America's most advanced fighter by late 1943, but it was not useless. It rugged, strongly built, fast in a dive, and still dangerous at low and medium altitude when flown to its strengths. It also demanded discipline. The Japanese Nakajima Ki Oscar was lighter and exceptionally maneuverable. Lighter, a P-40 pilot who tried to follow an Oscar through a tight turning fight could quickly find the Japanese fighter inside his circle and behind his tail. The American response was to preserve speed, avoid prolonged turns, use diving attacks, and disengage before the enemy could exploit its superior maneuverability. Philip Adair had learned those lessons well. Born in Oklahoma in 1920, he had wanted to fly from an early age. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, he entered military service and completed pilot training at Luke Field, Arizona. He later joined the 89th Fighter Squadron of the 80th Fighter Group. The group initially trained with P-47 Thunderbolts in the United States, but it went overseas with P-40s. For a young pilot who had trained on a newer and more powerful fighter, the change may not have been welcome, yet Adair came to trust the Warhawk. He was still a second lieutenant in December 1943, but he already commanded D Flight. He had completed 42 combat missions before the morning of December 13. He also served as an assistant engineering officer and took a personal interest in keeping his aircraft in excellent condition. His crew chief, Carroll Peake, shared that pride. Adair called his P-40 Lulu Bell. The aircraft carried the number 44 and, unusually for a combat fighter, white wall tires, painted with material Adair had brought from the United States. He had also obtained an electric starter to replace the slower hand-cranked system. Those small details mattered on the morning of the raid. When seconds counted, Lulu Bell was ready. Daybreak on December 13th, 1943, was cool and clear, though a high haze reduced visibility. The 89th Fighter Squadron had been assigned patrol duty over the Hump Route, along with interdiction missions. Intelligence had warned that Japanese raids were possible. Adair drew the first patrol. He led 4 P-40s, with Lieutenant May as his element leader. The mission lasted about 3 hours and produced no contact with the enemy. When they returned to Nagaguli, other serviceable aircraft were already away on assignments. Adair had just completed his 43rd combat mission. He told Peake to service Lulu Bell immediately, and then went to the alert tent to wait for the other pilots. The rest lasted only moments. The red alert sounded. Peake was still in the cockpit, completing paperwork. He struck the electric starter, and the Allison engine came to life while Adair ran toward the aircraft. Peake climbed out on one side as Adair entered from the other. There was no careful pre-flight check, no time to fit the parachute, and no pause to fasten the harness. Adair advanced the throttle and passed the operations building already airborne. The squadron's standing procedure called for pilots to scramble and rendezvous over the field at 20,000 feet while maintaining radio silence. Adair circled upward, watching for the others. At 12,000 feet, none of his flight had yet joined him. That was when he saw what looked like 4 aircraft in the distance. On the next circuit, the shapes appeared larger. Adair called control and asked whether friendly aircraft were in the area. The answer was no. Ground observers had reported unidentified aircraft about 40 miles east, but Adair said the formation he could see was much closer, perhaps 15 miles from the base complex. Control initially insisted that the observer's report placed the unknown aircraft farther away. Adair had to trust his own eyes. He left the rendezvous point and flew east to investigate. The haze slowly released the truth. What had looked like 4 aircraft became 4 flights of bombers. In Adair's account, each flight contained 2 V formations of 3 aircraft, giving him a total of 24. The bombers were probably Mitsubishi Ki-21s, known by the Allied reporting name Sally. Around them were Japanese fighters, most likely Ki-43 Oscars. Adair and many other American pilots often referred to Japanese fighters generically as Zeros, even though the Mitsubishi Zero was a Navy aircraft, and the Oscar belonged to the Japanese Army. Adair estimated roughly 40 escorts. Some official histories later gave a lower count of about 20 bombers and 25 fighters. A lone pilot, observing a large moving formation through haze while preparing to fight, could not be expected to produce a perfect census. Whether the total was 45 or 64, the practical situation was the same. Adair was outnumbered by a force large enough to overwhelm him within seconds if he made the wrong move. The bombers appeared to be heading north of the base complex. Adair believed they intended to turn back toward the south, line up on the airfields, drop their bombs, and continue toward Burma. He began climbing behind and above the formation. No other friendly fighters were yet in position. Adair had choices, but none were comfortable. He could remain outside the formation, report its movements, and wait for support. That would protect his own aircraft and give him a better chance of surviving. It might also allow the bombers to complete their attack before help arrived. Or he could attack alone. His own account did not describe the decision as a search for glory. He saw the bombers approaching the main target complex and concluded that he could not remain above them and watch without attempting to interfere. He called control, estimated the time remaining before bomb release, and stated that he was going to attack and try to disrupt the bombing run. That distinction is important. Adair was not trying to destroy every bomber. He knew that was impossible. His purpose was to disturb the formation at the moment when steadiness and coordination mattered most. Level bombing depended upon order. Crews had to maintain position, heading, altitude, and timing. A sudden attack could force pilots to maneuver, compel gunners to react, and disrupt the lead aircraft from which the others took their cue. Even without shooting down a bomber, a fighter could reduce the accuracy of the formation. Adair placed Lulu Bell high above the bombers and their escorts. He planned to descend from the left, fire at the leading formation from maximum range, drop back toward the left echelon, and then swing behind the formations on the right. It was a complicated attack for one aircraft, and he knew the chance of inflicting major damage was small. Surprise was his most valuable advantage. He pushed the nose down. The P-40 gathered speed. The bombers grew larger in his windscreen. Adair opened fire at long range, sending tracers across the leading aircraft. He saw movement ripple through the formation as pilots reacted. He continued through the attack, moving toward the rear flights, before the escorts fully understood what was happening. Near the last bomber in the fourth formation, he concentrated on the left engine. His rounds struck the fuselage and engine area, and he saw flashes as his greater speed carried him beneath, and beyond the aircraft. Then the escorts arrived. Several Japanese fighters turned toward him as soon as he cleared the bombers. Adair did not try to fight them in a circle. He used a maneuver planned in advance, full forward pressure on the control stick, an outside roll under -G, and a high-speed dive. The P-40's weight and diving strength helped him open the distance. He stayed down until he believed the fighters had broken off, then pulled out and looked around. He was alone again. The Japanese fighters had returned to the bombers. Adair climbed back above and behind the formation. For a moment, the haze may have concealed him. He began a second approach toward the bombers, but this time, the escorts were ready. Fighters turned toward him from across the formation. A direct attack on the bombers was no longer possible. Adair still had a speed advantage from his descent, so he drove through the escorts, firing deflection shots whenever an aircraft crossed his sights. He saw hits. One Japanese fighter appeared to develop fire around its engine, but Adair could not remain to watch it. A lone pilot who focused too long on a damaged opponent might become an easy target for the next fighter in line. He escaped in another dive and climbed again. By then, the bombers had released their loads. Adair's original purpose, to interfere with the bombing, had passed. The enemy force was beginning to withdraw toward Burma. He could have ended the engagement, but the escorts remained within reach. and he believed he could attack them from above without plunging directly into the defensive fire of the bombers. He selected a fighter near the rear and began another pass. The first Japanese pilot saw him and turned away too sharply to offer a shot. Adair shifted to another aircraft. He fired before the second pilot could complete his maneuver. The Japanese fighter's landing gear began to drop. It lost control and fell into a spiral. Adair followed at a distance, moving to one side so he could observe without flying into the wreck. He watched the aircraft descend into the jungle of the Naga Hills and crash. It became his one confirmed victory from the battle. He immediately began climbing toward the retreating formation again. The bombers were already crossing the Naga Hills toward Japanese-held territory. Adair decided to make one more attempt against them. This time, the escorts anticipated him. Japanese fighters came in from the right, firing as they turned. Adair broke left and found more aircraft approaching from that direction. He tried his familiar diving escape, but fighters were rising from below with enough lead to place their fire across his path. Tracers passed close to Lulu Bell. Adair pushed the control stick forward and wound in full nose-down elevator trim to increase the dive. The maneuver carried him away from the immediate attack, but the Japanese rounds had begun to strike. Several hits landed on Lulu Bell. Then an explosion sounded behind the cockpit. Flame flashed forward around both sides of the armor plate behind Adair's seat. The fire disappeared almost immediately. It was a brief flash, not a continuing cockpit fire, but Adair had no time to inspect the damage. He was already diving at high speed, and the jungle was rising toward him. He pulled back on the control stick. The response was weak. Adair reached for the elevator trim crank, remembering that he had applied full nose-down trim during the escape. The crank turned freely, but produced no effect. Something in the control or trim system had been damaged. He reduced power and pulled with both hands. For several terrible seconds, Lulu Bell continued toward the trees. At last, the nose lifted above the jungle. The battle was behind him, but home was about 125 miles away. Lulu Bell's engine still ran smoothly. The main problem was the aircraft's extreme nose-heavy condition. Adair needed both hands on the control stick simply to keep the nose above the horizon. He did not know with certainty whether he was over friendly or hostile territory. His ammunition supply was nearly gone, his aircraft was damaged, and his arms were already beginning to tire. Then another fighter appeared ahead. It passed slightly higher and about a quarter-mile to his left. As it came closer, Adair identified it as Japanese. The aircraft was smoking heavily and losing altitude. It made no immediate move to attack him. Adair could have let it go. Instead, seeing that the Japanese fighter appeared to be in even worse condition than Lulu Bell, he turned in behind it. With full power and both hands struggling against the control stick, he closed to roughly 100 yards and centered the gun sight. He pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. There was not a single round left. His higher speed nearly carried him into the damaged fighter. Adair pulled hard to avoid a collision and passed by. Tracers appeared near his left wing shortly afterward, but none struck. It was the last enemy aircraft he saw that day. He still had about 90 miles to fly. The strain on his arms became severe. As the adrenaline of combat faded, the control pressure seemed to increase. He tried to loop the safety belt, around the stick to help hold it back, but the belt was too short. He could find nothing else in the cockpit that would take the load. The situation narrowed to two possibilities. He could abandon Lulu Bell and parachute into the jungle if he could get clear of the aircraft, and if the parachute were available and usable after his hurried takeoff. Or he could remain aboard until exhaustion forced the nose down. Then he thought of the damaged trim in a different way. If the aircraft insisted upon pitching nose down while upright, rolling inverted would reverse the effect relative to the Earth. What had been an uncontrollable descent could become a climb. Adair rolled Lulu Bell upside down. The idea worked. With the aircraft inverted, the nose-heavy condition carried it upward. For a short time, Adair could gain altitude without holding the control stick against the full force that had exhausted his arms. But the solution created another problem. The P-40's engine and fuel system were not intended for prolonged, inverted flight. After what felt like a couple of minutes, the engine began to load up and threatened to quit. Adair rolled upright long enough for the engine to clear. The nose immediately tried to drop again. He then rolled inverted for another climb. He repeated the process across northeast India, inverted to gain altitude, upright to restore normal engine operation, then inverted again before the aircraft could descend too far. He later said he did not know how many times he flipped Lulu Bell during the journey. The method was dangerous, physically punishing, and unlike anything prescribed in a normal emergency checklist. Yet it kept the P-40 in the air. Eventually, Nagahuli appeared ahead. Adair was roughly half a mile from the airfield and about 1,000 feet above the ground. He approached from the south, the wrong direction for the field, and he was still upside down. The air raid warning remained in effect. To men on the ground, an inverted aircraft approaching from an unexpected direction could easily be mistaken for an enemy fighter. The anti-aircraft crews nearly opened fire. Adair's own ground personnel later told him that no one immediately recognized an upside-down P-40, especially one with its wheels pointing toward the sky. There was no room for a normal traffic pattern. Adair reduced power while inverted and aimed for the runway. At the last possible moment, he selected the landing gear and used the hydraulic pump. He saw the indicator confirm that the wheels were down and locked. Then he rolled Lulu Bell upright, lowered the flaps, and closed the throttle. The landing was not elegant. He touched down from the wrong direction, and without the controlled three-point arrival he normally preferred. But the aircraft stayed together. Lulu Bell rolled to a stop. Adair was back on the ground. For a moment, the airfield looked deserted because personnel was still under red alert procedures. Then his ground crew ran to the aircraft and helped him climb out. His arms and shoulders had been forced to hold the weight of the damaged controls for much of the return journey. He later joked that it took days for his arms to return to their normal length. The debriefing revealed that the Japanese bomb pattern had fallen short and somewhat to the side of the main target area. Damage was limited. Some men believed Adair's attack had contributed to the poor bombing. Adair himself remained doubtful. The odds had been so great, he wrote later, that he was not certain one fighter could have affected the result very much. His uncertainty should not be removed from the story. It is part of what makes his account credible. Adair did not claim that he had defeated the raid by himself. He understood that wartime results rarely belonged to one man. Bombing could fail because of weather, navigation, formation errors, evasive action, anti-aircraft fire, fighter interference, or several causes acting together. The available evidence supports the conclusion that his attack disrupted the formation at a critical moment, but it does not allow us to measure exactly how many bombs missed because of him. What can be said with confidence is that he attacked before the bomb release, forced the enemy to react, damaged at least one bomber, fought through the escorts, and kept pressure on the formation. The main target complex was missed, and the airfields suffered little damage. Adair was not the only American pilot who reached the enemy that morning. The other members of his flight eventually became airborne. Lieutenant May, Adair's element leader from the earlier patrol, was the only other pilot from the group to make contact with the Japanese formation. May pressed an attack on the bombers and shot one down. Defensive fire destroyed the engine of his P-40, forcing him to bail out. He suffered burns to his face, but survived and returned. May's part of the action matters. The dramatic image of one pilot facing an entire raid is accurate for the opening phase, when Adair first reached the formation alone. It should not erase the second pilot who entered the fight, destroyed a bomber, and lost his aircraft. War is rarely the work of a single hero. It is a chain of men, carrying out separate actions under the same danger. The observers who reported the raid, the controllers trying to understand conflicting information, the mechanics who kept the fighters serviceable, the pilots who scrambled, the anti-aircraft crews guarding the fields, and the transport crews waiting to cross the mountains after the danger passed. Adair's 44th combat mission became the most memorable flight of his life. The number seemed especially appropriate because Lulu Bell also carried 44 on her fuselage. The aircraft required about 3 days of repairs. Adair needed roughly the same time to recover from the muscular strain of the return flight. Despite the prolonged use of emergency power and repeated inverted flight, mechanics found no damaging metal in the engine filter. Adair later described the P-40 as a reliable old aircraft, perhaps a little slow, but capable of becoming surprisingly fast when its pilot was frightened. Between two P-40s that carried the name Lulu Bell, he completed 113 combat missions before converting to P-47s. He wrote that the Warhawk never failed to bring him home. His official credit for the December 13 battle was 1 Japanese fighter destroyed, 1 fighter probably destroyed, and 1 bomber probably destroyed. Poor gun camera film made confirmation difficult. The footage did show fire trailing from the bomber's left engine and from the fighter, recorded as a probable victory. For his actions, Philip Adair received the Silver Star. He continued flying in the China-Burma-India theater and eventually became an ace, credited with 5 aerial victories. He remained in military service after the war, completed a career that extended to 1971, and retired as a colonel. His decorations included the Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal, and Legion of Merit. Adair lived until 2017. He was 97 years old when he died. Across his long life, the mourning over Assam remained connected to a particular kind of courage. Adair did not believe himself invincible. He understood that a lone P-40 could not destroy the formation in front of him. He attacked because waiting might allow the bombers to strike before help arrived. The value of that decision was not measured only by the aircraft he shot down. In air defense, success can mean forcing an attacker from a steady course, disturbing a formation, or buying time. The Japanese raid missed the main target complex, damage was limited, and operations in Assam continued. It would be wrong to say that Adair single-handedly saved the entire hump. The airlift was too large and depended upon too many people for such a claim. But it would also be wrong to dismiss his action because only one victory was confirmed. He reached the raid alone, attacked before bomb release, fought through the escorts, and brought home a crippled aircraft through repeated inverted flight. Those facts require no exaggeration. The astonishing part of the story is not that Philip Adair defeated 64 aircraft. He did not. It is that he knew he could not defeat them and attacked anyway, because destruction was not the immediate task. The task was to interfere. The task was to make the bombers miss. The task was to stand between the formation above and the vulnerable airfields below, for as long as one aircraft and one exhausted pilot could remain in the sky. Adair never claimed certainty about how much difference he made. The records show that he attacked, that the main target was missed, that Lieutenant May also fought and survived the loss of his aircraft, and that Adair returned in a badly damaged P-40. History cannot calculate the exact value of every burst of gunfire or every second of delay. It can remember the decision. One pilot was alone above Assam. A Japanese raid was approaching. The men and machines below had little time. Philip Adair went in. If this story reminds you of a veteran in your own family, a father, grandfather, uncle, brother, or friend who served in a distant theater and rarely spoke about it, write his name in the comments. Tell us where he served and where you are watching from today. The forgotten fronts remain forgotten only when their names are no longer spoken. Thank you for watching.